You begin with the assumption that what feels clear to you must therefore be true. You trust your judgments because they appear coherent, and coherence seems to function as proof. Yet Al-Ghazali urges you to pause. He suggests that the clarity you rely on might not arise from truth but from habit. When a thought repeats often enough, the mind mistakes repetition for verification. As you reflect, you notice how rarely you question the basis of your confidence. You examine conclusions that the mind presents, but you seldom examine the mechanism that produces them. Certainty begins to loosen, not because it is false, but because you see how casually it was accepted. If certainty depends on habit rather than inquiry, what is the nature of that certainty? You lived in a world shaped by structured debate and competing claims to knowledge. Baghdad in his era contained legal theorists, theologians, philosophers, and mystics, each asserting a path toward truth. Their systems were rigorous, and their reasoning was refined, yet none of them produced a certainty that satisfied the mind completely. Every school critiqued the others with equal force, revealing the limits of each method. Al-Ghazali recognized that this diversity of confidence exposed a deeper uncertainty beneath it. If every method claims authority yet denies the others, how do you measure what truth requires? As Al-Ghazali examined the foundations of knowledge, he realized that each form contained unavoidable vulnerabilities. The senses could be mistaken. Reason could contradict itself. Theological claims relied on assumptions that the intellect could not independently validate. You notice the same structure in yourself: confidence built on experiences you never tested and beliefs you accepted before questioning their origin. This realization does not destroy knowledge. It reveals its dependency on conditions that often go unnoticed. Al-Ghazali understood that certainty cannot rest on mechanisms that fail under scrutiny. True understanding must begin with a more honest assessment of how the mind knows. If the foundations of knowing cannot guarantee themselves, what grants knowledge its reliability? Reason evaluates, organizes, and clarifies. You rely on it to examine claims, uncover errors, and establish structure. Yet Al-Ghazali observed that reason cannot step outside itself to prove its own validity. It judges using the very standards it creates. When you reflect on this, you notice the circularity embedded within your thinking. You trust your conclusions because they match the patterns your mind has already accepted. You rely on reasoning that was shaped by assumptions you never chose, and you rarely investigate those assumptions directly. This does not diminish the value of reason, but it exposes its limits. Reason is effective within its domain but cannot certify the origin of its authority. You begin to see that the intellect's greatest strength, its ability to construct coherent systems, also reveals its weakness. A system can be internally consistent yet disconnected from reality. Coherence alone is not proof. Recognizing this shifts your relationship with thought. Instead of treating reason as an unquestionable foundation, you see it as an instrument that requires guidance. If the judge cannot evaluate itself without circularity, how can its verdict be final? Al-Ghazali treated doubt not as disruption but as refinement. Doubt becomes a method for removing unexamined attachments embedded within the mind. You begin to see how much of what you believe is inherited rather than discovered. The mind absorbs patterns from culture, upbringing, and repetition, then presents these patterns as personal insight. When you question these patterns, their authority weakens. Doubt clears away what was accepted unconsciously. This process is not emotional turmoil but intellectual honesty. Doubt forces you to observe the gap between what you assume and what you actually know. The mind's automatic recoil from uncertainty becomes a sign of how deeply it depends on familiarity. As you continue questioning, doubt becomes a disciplined practice, an instrument that exposes whatever lacks genuine grounding. It eliminates the beliefs that collapse under examination and reveals those that remain stable without external support. Through this purification, the mind becomes lighter and more precise. If doubt only threatens what lacks foundation, why defend what cannot endure scrutiny? Al-Ghazali reached a stage where rational inquiry could advance no further. He had refined arguments, exposed assumptions, and examined contradictions. Yet reason could not provide the self-validating certainty he sought. You encounter a similar point in your own inquiry. The mind reaches the boundary of its capacity to confirm itself. Argument becomes repetitive. Analysis becomes circular. Beyond a certain threshold, additional reasoning does not increase clarity, it intensifies confusion. This limit is not a failure but a recognition of the nature of the intellect. Reason can reveal inconsistencies, but it cannot produce the independent standard required to measure its own reliability. Once you understand this, the pressure on the mind begins to soften. You no longer expect reason to carry a weight it cannot sustain. This breakpoint marks an essential transition. When the intellect acknowledges its limits, it becomes more honest. It becomes a tool rather than a master. If the road of analysis reaches a boundary it cannot cross, what leads you beyond that boundary? Al-Ghazali discovered that awareness precedes reasoning. Before the mind interprets reality, reality is already present. You begin to see the same structure within your own experience. Thought does not generate awareness, it operates within it. When you notice this, the hierarchy shifts. Reason no longer appears as the foundation of certainty but as an activity occurring inside a deeper field of knowing. This recognition does not reject logic. It places logic in its proper relationship to the ground of awareness. Awareness is immediate, not constructed. It does not derive legitimacy from argument. Instead, argument derives legitimacy from the clarity of the awareness using it. When you observe thought from this vantage point, the need to solidify conclusions lessens. You notice that insight arises not from reinterpreting ideas but from seeing without distortion. This seeing is not conceptual, it is direct. Understanding becomes less like assembling information and more like recognizing what is evident when the mind stops imposing expectations. If awareness knows before thought begins, what does thought contribute to knowing? For Al-Ghazali, reason regained stability when it accepted its proper role. Instead of claiming authority over truth, reason becomes an instrument that organizes and clarifies what awareness perceives directly. You recognize this shift within yourself. Reasoning becomes more accurate when it no longer tries to anchor certainty. It becomes a means of articulation, not the origin of clarity. This reconciliation resolves the false conflict between rational inquiry and inner understanding. Each has a domain. Reason distinguishes, analyzes, and refines. Awareness recognizes, understands, and confirms. When they work together, the search for certainty becomes coherent. You see that the crisis of knowledge emerged not because reason was flawed, but because it was assigned a responsibility it could not fulfill. Once it returns to its rightful position, the intellect operates with precision rather than strain. Certainty begins to feel less like a position you defend and more like a quiet recognition that requires no justification. If reason becomes reliable only when it accepts its limits, what gives those limits their authority? Doubt revealed the insufficiency of the mind's self-reliance. It exposed the tendency to cling to familiar beliefs and mistake them for truth. Yet the purpose of doubt was never to leave you empty. It was to make space for clarity that does not depend on intellectual control. You begin to notice that the mind's insistence on certainty is driven by the desire to possess truth. But possession distorts perception. When the urge to control drops away, understanding emerges without being forced. This surrender is not passivity, it is precision. It acknowledges that certainty cannot be manufactured through argument. Instead, it appears when the mind stops imposing its expectations on reality. Al-Ghazali recognized that real certainty arises when the thinker no longer attempts to dominate the process of knowing. Doubt served as the tool that dismantled this domination. If certainty appears only when you stop trying to possess it, what becomes of the self that once demanded ownership? At the end of inquiry, the mind becomes quiet. It has examined its assumptions, reached its limits, and released its insistence on mastery. Doubt has completed its function not by destroying knowledge, but by clearing the space in which genuine clarity can appear. What remains is neither argument nor belief. It is a stillness in which truth does not need to be proven because it is no longer being pursued. The searcher relaxes, and understanding stands on its own. There is nothing to defend, nothing to confirm, nothing to secure. If truth is evident without assertion, what becomes of the one who insisted on finding it?